Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss policies which Labour are giving the impression of adopting, which are, I think, mistakes. Not just in terms of being bad policies, because some bad policies are necessary, as I'll explain, but mistakes because they're both bad policies and it's not clear why they're even politically useful. I'm going to discuss the puberty blockers case here. Now, there are a couple of other examples of this sort of potential mistake brewing, but they are not as clear cut. I want to focus on this because I've got plenty to say about it, and it is by far and away the least defensible policy. If indeed it is a policy, I spend a lot of time warning people, listen to the specific wording of politicians, not what someone else paraphrases. And, I have to just say, I have not seen a direct quote from Streeting himself. However, as I'll aim to explain, it's credible enough to discuss. But to begin with, let me just be really clear on the necessity for politically dubious policies at times. There are times when a party in government, and they all do it, adopts a position that it doesn't really agree with, but because it needs to remain in step with public opinion. And when I say public opinion, I mean important voter opinion. So not really majority public opinion. It's why one of the arguments I make why Labour would benefit from PR is you don't have to overreach so much when it comes to target voters. Labour had their target voters dictated to them by, the nature of the spread of the country. But if one person's vote is just as valuable as another's, it's way easier to adopt policies you're more comfortable with. It means less internal strife. You'll never remove it entirely, but less strife is a good thing. Labour won this election by sacrificing some core support where they could afford it in order to reach for swing support where it was needed. A different system would mean making a more comfortable stretch for the swing votes. You wouldn't need to go as far afield for them. But sometimes a government adopts a policy which is not only out of step with its core beliefs, it's not even politically useful. And this is what classes for me as a policy error. And if the reporting is even close to being accurate here, Wes Streeting is about to make a big one. Now, the issue is puberty blockers, like I say, should be a simple case, politically speaking. Puberty blockers were banned for NHS treatment by the Conservatives really recently, height of their culture wars. But there have been moves to withdraw treatment for young trans people going right back through the last two parliaments. There's evidence that the anti-trans policies forced on the NHS have been fairly disastrous, due to a huge surge in suicides amongst young trans people who were being denied the care that they'd previously been getting. Now, I will just add, we have to be careful with the old causal links here, but the last two parliaments from Theresa May onwards saw a concerted effort to provide less NHS care to young trans people, born seemingly out of the belief that they didn't need that care. And the High Court has been told that there was one suicide amongst this group in the 7 years before these policies began. And then there were 16 in the 3 years that followed. And there's been several years since and many more suicides since. And puberty blockers, they're not some newfangled experimental treatment. They've been used for like decades on the NHS without anyone making a fuss. They were used by the NHS when the last Labour government were in power. No one had an issue with it. And given that the treatment has existed since before I was born, it may even be that the NHS were using them during Harold Wilson's time in government. I don't know. I do know that it only became an issue when we elected a Brexit government that was intent on crashing our country to save their precious party, and so they needed to arrange a lot of distractions. I suppose having the architect of the hostile environment as Prime Minister didn't help. Now, it may well be that the court case, which took place yesterday, is successful. We'll hopefully find out next week. If the government wishes to keep pushing it, it will, I suppose, end up in the Supreme Court. If it's found to be unlawful all down the line, obviously Wes Streeting is not going to defy the court ruling. But there are a couple of things about that. The first is we do not know if this is unlawful. We only know it's bad policy based on reports which were commissioned by the most unscrupulous, unscientific and callous government this government has had in modern times. And if the courts rule that there has been an error in law by the government, then all that happens is Streeting and Labour more widely look like they're being forced to do the right thing rather than actually wanting to do so. But the mistake's worse than that. This is politically inept. So I come at things from a political angle on this channel. There's lots of angles you can come at from this. I come at it from the political angle. We know there's a lot of ignorance around trans issues and I'm not an expert. And it absolutely became a hot potato. But we also know from polling that it has extremely low salience amongst those who don't live the issues day to day. That means Lots of people have got a view and lots of people have got the wrong view, but the vast majority don't care. It's not a factor in their voting decisions. On Thursday, Angela Rayner withdrew the government's legal case in favour of the establishment of a new coal mine in Cumbria. So that's basically stopped. You know, the Conservative, there was a legal argument that the planning permission wasn't given lawfully. The Conservative government challenging this in court. The Labour government now say we're not challenging this anymore. We agree that the planning permission shouldn't have been given. Done. Streeting could have done the same thing with this case. The case would still have gone ahead because Northern Ireland are also fighting the same case. But Streeting could have withdrawn the Westminster government's rolling proceedings and just waited the decision. And here's the thing. If Streeting had done that and then quietly changed the policy, nobody would be talking about it now. Nobody would be making a fuss. And more importantly, nobody would be talking about it at the next election. Like, normally you front load your high anxiety policies at the start of the parliamentary cycle, specifically because as long as it's the right policy, people will have seen that the doom and gloom predicted never happened a few years later. But nobody even cares about this right now. People aren't talking about puberty blockers on the NHS. They're talking about NHS waiting lists, which are not being propped up by the tiny number of trans people who need care. They may be, by now, a larger number of trans people who may be self-harming. In fact, as suicides would likely go down with better policies come the next election, you would have proof that the decision was a good one in black and white. Just screams no-brainer. And the reverse is true. A policy like this risks a major story blowing up about the rise of trans suicides amongst the young. You know, Brianna Gay created a focus on trans people last year, and that was a murder. Well, imagine a similar story making it in the news, but it's actually the government's fault. Labour being directly responsible for it. Has Streeting taken on the same political advisors that Sunak was using or something? And there's another terrible dimension to this as well. So Wes Streeting has, this very week, defended the idea that healthcare in this country should be provided free at point of contact by the NHS. Well, here's the thing. If this policy of supporting the puberty blocker ban goes ahead, and I am going to, again, point out, I don't know this is the case. A lot of people saying it is. The only paper that reported on it yesterday was The Telegraph, and they've been making all sorts of shit up this week. But the source was Joe Moam of the Good Law Project, who was involved with the court case, so I'm going to consider it reliable. But this idea of defending healthcare free at point of access is at odds with this policy. If this indeed is the policy, because this policy would not ban puberty blockers. They would still be legally available in the UK. And if you wanted access to the treatment, you'd be able to get access to the treatment if you can pay. It's just that the NHS wouldn't be using them, or at least not for this specific purpose, which means they remain available just as they've been for decades, but only if you can pay privately. Now, if the government really thought this treatment was harmful, wouldn't they be banning their use privately as well? Does Wes Streeting really want his first act as Health Secretary to be to make NHS treatment, which has been available on the NHS for decades, with not a single shit being given by successive governments, suddenly only available for those who can afford private treatment? Because that is the opposite of defending treatment being free at point of access. Either a treatment is harmful or it is not. If it is harmful, you legislate against its use everywhere, and it is banned nationally. If you are happy for private providers to use it, but not the NHS, then what you're saying is that it shouldn't be a form of universal healthcare, free at point of access. Just every angle of this would be a terrible policy. It makes no sense medically because the treatment isn't banned. The NHS approach of recent years has reportedly led to a huge number of suicides. That means young people died because they were denied treatment. I read the NHS briefing paper from 2020 and it was entirely based on, oh, we're not really sure this is effective. It wasn't really, oh, yes, it's causing loads of harm. It was like, we're not really sure this is effective. It's like, well, if you're not sure it does much good, but it does stop young people killing themselves, I'd say keep using it, pal. A treatment against suicide, even if it really does little else, sounds worth it to me. Literally a treatment that stops teenagers dying. What sort of mug says, yeah, we don't need that? Only we're talking about a treatment that's been used for decades and with no evidence that the medical scientific community suddenly has an issue with this. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that the move was political, not medical. But this is politically a nightmare as well. It attracts zero credit because the people who don't get trans issues might have an uninformed view, but they don't care. It's not what they think about with that pencil in their hand at the ballot box in another 4 or 5 years' time. And that's not me just, imagining that. We know that from polling. Very, very, very low salience. And as for the reporting in the here and now, the newspapers were not, if Streeting made a different decision, the newspapers wouldn't go at this like a dog in the bone. Labour are causing them to lose their minds on so many issues. They are way more bothered about the threat to corporate interests in the oil and water industries than puberty blockers, which are sold to the NHS by corporations anyway. But although those who don't understand the issues don't care, there are people who are trans, and way more people, because we say, oh, there's hardly any trans people. Sure, but there's way more people who care about a trans person because they know them personally. They were already concerned and now aren't feeling entirely safe with a government who would do this. Now, for these people, it has very high salience. So you've got zero political benefits. There is no future in which this gives Labour any political credit. But there is obvious political cost, and there is a very real political risk. And Labour do have positive policies to improve protections for trans people. So, I mean, why give with one hand and take with the other? It just creates confusion and mistrust, which is to be avoided at the best of times, but especially so with particularly vulnerable groups. It's insane. It runs counter to all the really good work that the new government have been doing this week, including from Streeting himself, if you don't count this brain fart of a baffling origin. I mean, yeah, what Labour have done in their first week's been very encouraging. In fact, they've gone faster and further than I expected in some areas. And yes, I've always said they're going to make mistakes. Ministers of any party can get the wrong person whispering in their ear and make a hash of things. But this is such an obviously bad decision, medically, administratively, and politically. Just beggars belief. Assuming this is the policy, and I emphasise, I've seen no direct quote from Streeting, then I have seen not one single argument in favour of it. And I've looked, I've tried to find them, and I can't think of one myself. And I always look for the political thinking behind a dubious policy, because that almost always explains it. It's the greater good argument. And sometimes the greater good argument is an argument. But for this, I can think of absolutely no political benefit for Labour. I can see a hell of a lot of political risk. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.